One of the most frustrating notions that has become widespread throughout the Sonic community over the past decade plus is that the characters have become Flanderized. Many Sonic fans believe that a lot of the characters have become one note, that their defining traits have become so emphasized compared to other traits that round them out. Usually, I would try to come up with some creative opening statement before diving into a subject like this, but I just don't believe this to be true for the Sonic cast, and I'm using Team Sonic and Shadow the Hedgehog to help make my overall point that a lot of fans are simply mixing their negative feelings of the 2010 Sonic era with the lack of character development that happened in that decade, which would mean that the characters stagnated to some extent. But stagnation and Flanderization are two separate things. I want to give a shout out to everyone who voted and commented on my post asking if they believed the characters were either Flanderized and derailed or not. The majority believed they were, but the comments people left behind were full of explanations that didn't simply boil down their dislike for the writing as Flanderization, which I appreciated. I'm not here to argue that the stories and characters were written well. In fact, I can agree that some level of derailment happened with these characters. I just think that boiling all these problems down to Flanderization is a lazy and largely untrue description for them. Flanderization is the process through which a complex fictional character's essential traits are oversimplified to the point where they constitute their entire personality, or at least exaggerated while other traits remain over the course of a serial work. Let's start with Sonic himself. This guy is probably the most misunderstood character in the entire franchise. I've seen a myriad of opinions about Sonic's character. Some believe he's just a dude who spouts a bunch of one-liners in a desperate attempt to remind the fanbase of how cool he used to be in the 90s. I've seen others come to dislike Sonic's constant attempts to see characters who've done wrong be rehabilitated in the comics, and while I agree that the comic has some wonky writing, I think people often mistake Sonic's wanting to see others decide for themselves, or at least guide them in the right direction whenever he can, as some sort of exaggerated weak-willed pacifism, but Sonic has always been this way. The only problem with this in the comics, aside from obvious interpretation of the character, is that he's speaking more. So traits and actions Sonic takes in the games are highlighted by the heavier dialogue of the comics. I won't argue if highlighting this trait of Sonic has been executed well to its fullest potential or if it's dog shit. My point is that even if this trait of Sonic's character is being highlighted, it's not a case of Flanderization. In regards to the games, I'll say this. The writing for Sonic in games like Lost World and the Wii version of Colors wasn't the best, but at the core of all that awful 2010 snark, fourth wall breaking, self-referential humor is the same Sonic with a heart of gold, always doing what he thinks is right. Alongside the bad writing, the good of Sonic's character is still being highlighted. It was just being handled by some shitty writers. There was an attempt to pull back on some of the mean-spirited energy from Lost World and Forces, where the characters are closer to how they were before Pontaff came in, but the writing in that game is so goddamn uninspiring that it makes people just say it's bad because, well, it ain't good. I've already made a longer video about Sonic's character already, so I advise that you watch that if you want more of my opinion on Sonic's character. Tails is probably the best case for character stagnation versus Flanderization. Throughout the 2000s, Tails is portrayed as a technological genius, capable of getting his hands dirty when needed. Over time, however, Tails' proficiency for developing technology led him to being less physical, often running for cover when faced with enemies, allowing Sonic to do what he does best. I think it's interesting that nobody really makes a big stink of Tails running away from Gaia enemies in that one cutscene in Unleashed, but love bringing up him cowering in fear of Chaos Zero and Forces as a slight against the character's progression. The point of me bringing this up is because the issue of Tails cowering from a fight is not some recent development due to what many claim as character regression or Flanderization. Truth is, Tails has always been written with some inconsistency for a long time. It's been a frustrating inconsistency, but that's not at all a sign of Flanderization. Tails is a kid. I'm not saying that it's a realistic portrayal of the ups and downs an 8-year-old might face when placed in certain situations, but it makes sense for Tails to be the most easily spooked and unsure of himself of the heroes, seeing as he is one of the youngest characters in the franchise. We see shit like this happen in Sonic Heroes. I'm not excusing the inconsistent writing. I think people are mistaking Tails' inconsistency with being Flanderized as a character. There are so many instances where Tails' character fluctuates in the games, especially in the 2010s. In Colors, he adapts Sonic's sarcasm and playfulness. In Lost World, he's more prone to anger, and it comes with him taking action physically to save Sonic a few times, which is actually a positive that gets lost in, Lost World's overall poor writing. In my opinion, Tails in Sonic Forces is much closer to how he behaves in Sonic Unleashed, and I wouldn't say that any one character in Sonic Forces is written horribly except for Infinite. I'd argue that the general dialogue and plot progression is bad, but that doesn't indicate that the characters themselves were Flanderized. They're just dull. Bottom line, Tails has suffered from inconsistent writing more than anyone else, which has led to his progression stagnating. Sonic Frontiers' story addressed this, and hopefully we see Tails continue to grow, or at least see the results of whatever off-screen growth happens. The problem many people had with Knuckles for years was that he's been relegated to being the comedy character. He was seen as the butt of jokes, but from my understanding, I don't see how in any of the 2010s games this is seen to such an extent that it became his defining Flanderized trait. Amy has a funny scene shoving him into a tree in Generations, and then after that, he's there in Lost World with Amy while Sonic and Tails are in the Lost Hex. In Forces, he's the leader of the Resistance, and I can't remember too many times, or any moment at all, where Knuckles is treated as a joke in that game. Are we sure people aren't just remembering the memes and Boom Knuckles primarily here? The Master Emerald not being present or being a big part of his character has been a thing since 2003. Sonic Team just happened to create stories where the Master Emerald wasn't a factor, and I think that's fine. It's still part of Knuckles' story and lore, and they went back to it with Sonic Frontiers, even though they ironically portrayed Knuckles as someone who wants to do more adventuring away from that Master Emerald, even though he's already been doing that for years anyway. Even in Frontiers, Knuckles has a lot of lines that are meant to be funny. Knuckles has been having funny moments since his debut where he fell off the scaffolding in Launch Base Zone. I guarantee you that you'll find at least one scene in almost every 3D Sonic game Knuckles is in funny, or see that it was meant to be funny. This gross oversimplification believing that Knuckles became nothing more than a dumb funny guy in the 2010s, in my opinion, is just untrue. He's always been a silly guy forced to lock in. Before I get to Amy, I want to add that I don't like the way some fans seem to have this weird stance against characters showing off some of their more simplistic traits. I won't put the tweet up, but there was a tweet comparing Knuckles' dialogue in the main story of Frontiers, where he compares the architecture of the Ancients to the Knuckles clan and makes a lot of interesting observations about them. Later in Final Horizon, he's eager to smash things with his fists, and somehow people in the replies thought this was Knuckles being Flanderized. This completely ignores the context that in the base game he can't do anything to help. And in the Final Horizon, he finally gets the chance to use his strength to bust up some enemies and help Sonic, so he's full of energy. You can see how the context helps you understand why Knuckles behaves the way he does here. It's not a crime for him to be inquisitive about the history that hits close to home for him, and also be a dude who loves to punch things. He can be both at any given time within the proper context, and that's fine. You can say that you don't like Knuckles being the punchy guy, and that's fine too. It's not a case of him being Flanderized though. It's about striking a balance. Do people just want these characters to behave one way all the time? I'm not even sure what the case for Amy being Flanderized is. She's like the only character who had any real sense of character shift or progression this past decade. Way back in Sonic Adventure 1, she vowed to become a person Sonic can respect, and since then we've seen Amy take active roles in helping Sonic save the world, all while adopting her own leadership skills as seen in Sonic Heroes and again in Sonic Forces, where she's the co-leader of the Resistance alongside Knuckles. The comics continue to highlight Amy's development as a character while maintaining her love for Sonic. I remember when people used to shit on Amy for being so fixated on Sonic, and now I see people saying that it's a problem that her crush isn't as pronounced anymore. I remember when one of the few good things you could say about Lost World's story was that Amy wasn't thirsting after Sonic all the time. Times certainly have changed. I feel like an old man doing the back in my day bit with no hint of irony. Amy is still very much the spirited girl madly in love with Sonic as she was in the 2000s. She's just grown up a little is all. I've seen people refer to Shadow the Hedgehog as nothing more than a brooding edgelord, an asshole, Vegeta 2.0, Sasuke, you get the point. While it's true that we've seen more of Shadow as Sonic's rival, being more competitive than we usually see in the games like Sonic Free Riders, Shadow's character hasn't really changed since the resolution of his arc at the end of his titular game and the expansion we got of his character in 06. Shadow in Free Riders still displays that natural arrogance, the competitive edge, the ability to show concern and care for artificially created life that he's always shown. While we don't see much of Shadow in Forces, he's handled well in his own little story for that game. I've already made 2 videos about Shadow's character not being what many fans think he is, so go check those out for my deeper dive into Shadow's character. Some fans seeing him being a brooding edgelord as a bad thing is hilarious, with how the reception for what we've seen in Shadow Generation so far is that Shadow being edgy is fucking cool. The people who dislike that are entitled to feel that way, but I think equating edgy to being bad is the result of other edgy characters being horribly written in other media. So people assume that the archetype is inherently bad, which isn't true. I also think people saw his portrayal in Sonic Boom and felt like that's how SEGA wanted the character to be written due to mandates, but the mainline game Shadow appears in during this period handle him well enough. He isn't featured much in a lot of the mainline games in the 2010s anyway, so I personally can't see how you can claim Shadow's been Flanderized when he's made appearances in 3 games, with one of them being an anniversary game that he briefly shows up in twice, and another being a short DLC story. I'm going to circle back to what I originally said at the start of all this. I think some Sonic fans are conflating memes, the general style of humor displayed by the social media team, and Sonic Boom with how they perceive these characters. A lot of the Sonic cast simply hasn't been featured heavily enough, or at all to even warrant a discussion about Flanderization. Where they do show up is in the comics, and a lot of the characters that were pushed to the background play pivotal roles in many of the comic story arcs. Some of you may ask, why should I have to read the comics to see these characters? Why can't Sonic Team just feature them in more games? The beauty of the comic being there is getting to see some decent stories featuring characters who don't always get the spotlight in the games. It's even better now that the comics are canon, because it means that their actions, their progression, their stories matter to some extent. Read the IDW comics. I personally don't think they're amazing, and I can't guarantee that it'll scratch that itch for everybody, but the attempt to include the lesser used characters in bigger stories is commendable, and I personally enjoy seeing some of the characters interact with each other, mostly because I don't need every character to receive a crazy amount of development. I just need them to be dynamic enough that whenever we get an odd pairing, we can see how their personalities match with each other. I personally think the Sonic games should take this approach with their stories after they finish giving certain characters their proper development. It would help flesh out the stories beyond the overarching plot. Sonic Frontiers does this well. As for why a lot of the characters don't appear in Sonic games, I think that after the reception to games like 06, SEGA probably wanted the team to create Sonic games using smaller casts, with the focus being mostly on the Blue Hedgehog himself. For a lot of these characters, claims that they've been Flanderized aren't true for the simple fact that they haven't been featured in any meaningful way since 2010. You can't claim a bunch of characters have been subject to Flanderization if they're not around all that much or at all to begin with. The bits and pieces we do get of these characters suggest that at worst, no development has taken place. No development or shift in character traits does not equate to being Flanderized. It suggests a deeper problem with the writing in general. I want people to understand this because that word gets thrown around so much with no room for nuance, like how any other buzzword or phrase gets thrown around in online spaces these days. I think the past 10 plus years of self-aware nonsensical humor, subpar video games, and awful portrayal of characters and spin-offs left a lot of Sonic fans disillusioned. The brand clearly had no real direction for a decade and it showed. Do I think that lends any credence to the case of Flanderization taking place? Not really. Take away the dumb memes, take away the ironic humor that surrounded the franchise for an entire decade. Just focus on the stories we got from the mainline games and later with the comics. I genuinely don't believe that a lot of you simply believe the characters are Flanderized. There must be something more there, even if you do think they are. There has to be a deeper explanation. Maybe I'm just driving myself insane, and for a lot of you, it is what it is. This is just what I personally believe though. I've offered my own argument to a broader discussion that I find both frustrating and interesting. What do you believe? Do you believe that the characters are Flanderized for a long time? Do you believe that some were derailed? Was there an obvious halt in development for many of them? Do you agree with me? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Shout out to you for watching this video. Check the channel for more Sonic goodness. I'm out. Peace.